Hello and welcome. This is Deep Dive and I'm Tiffany Meier. What happens on January 20th if election disputes remain uncertain and no president is sworn in? What is the military going to do if there are nuclear codes? Who does the military recognize as commander-in-chief? We'll explore some scenarios later in the episode, but first, some updates. Today, December 8th, is Safe Harbor Day, or when all states are required to resolve election disputes. But there's still a lot of uncertainty in that regard. Will the Electoral College be able to make a decision by December 14th? And even if it does, Sidney Powell has said lawsuits could overturn those results. Lots of ambiguity. A major development today, Texas is suing 4 key battleground states. Texas is suing Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin over election rules. It's already been fast-tracked to the Supreme Court. Now, let's delve into some past examples of contested elections. The one that comes to mind and is most recent is Bush versus Gore from 2000. But there's another case that's more similar to our current election landscape. More on that later. Bush v. Gore shook the country. On election night 2000, TV networks called the key state of Florida for Gore, then Bush. Then it became too close to count. 3 weeks later, Americans finally had an answer. Florida declared Bush the winner. 537 votes, that's all the difference that separated them. It was a wild election. Ballots called into question, calls for recount, including hand recounts. Then the Supreme Court became involved, finally 2 rulings. First, that the Florida recount was unconstitutional, and second, that time had run out. Florida gave the votes to Bush, who had a lead at 271 Electoral College votes. Gore conceded. That case also changed the media landscape. Now, media is wary of calling election results too early and then having to retract it. But 2000 only involved one contested state, albeit a big one at that, Florida. That's a far cry from what we're seeing this year. Instead, there's another case that's more similar to what's happening now. Let's go back in time to 1876. Rutherford B. Hayes faced off against Democrat Samuel Tilden of New York. Tilden won the popular vote and was leading in the Electoral College, but 19 votes remained contested. Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina remained disputed. Just as there is now, back in 1876, there were allegations of widespread voter fraud. Congress even set up a special electoral commission to determine the winner. It was made up of 15 congressmen and Supreme Court judges. They only reached a decision 2 days before inauguration, and it was a narrow vote, 8-7 along party lines. Hayes ended up the winner. What's interesting to note, Tilden won the popular vote by over 260,000 votes, like Gore in 2000 when he won by over 500,000, and Clinton in 2016 by nearly 3 million. But it's the Electoral College vote that's important. Given the current uncertain political climate, there are questions on whether or not the Electoral College can make a decision on December 14th, which would then impact Congress to count electoral votes on January 6th and declare official election results, and finally for the president-elect to be inaugurated on January 20th. That brings us back to the question, what happens if on January 20th there is still uncertainty? A 54-page paper by law professor Edward Foley runs through some of those scenarios. Foley holds the Ebersole Chair in Constitutional Law at Ohio State University, where he heads the university's election law program. His paper from 2019, titled Preparing for a Disputed Presidential Election, an Exercise in Election Risk Assessment and Management. He starts off by weighing the possibilities of a contested 2020 election, not because of foreign interference or other events, but just based on ballot counting. He notes the changes made after the 2000 election, such as increase in absentee voting, which we saw on a scale never seen before this year in 2020. Foley starts out with a fictional scenario of election night 2020 that's eerily similar to what actually happened. The night starts off with Trump winning, but media aren't calling it. They're wary after the whole Bush v. Gore's case in 2000. Trump is tweeting that he won by a large amount, but by morning there is what Foley calls the blue shift overnight. more votes were counted and Trump's lead is slipping. Foley notes that did happen in previous elections, such as in the 2018 midterm elections. Arizona's Senate race flipped blue that year. Florida's governor races saw a similar scene. The Republicans were leading, but the day after election, they saw their lead slipping. The Republican governors went on to win those races, but it was close. If by January 20th, Trump refuses to concede and says he's still president, and Nancy Pelosi, as Speaker of the House, disagrees and says she's acting president, what happens then? Foley proposes a few scenarios. The state's legislature moves to exercise its authority under Article 2 of the Constitution to appoint the state's presidential electors directly. The two chambers would move to overthrow the popular vote and directly appoint the presidential electors, keeping the tally as it was on election night, with Trump still in the lead. But if no one is declared the winner on January 20th, Nancy Pelosi would step up after resigning as Speaker. That's under the succession statute enacted by Congress. But Foley notes there are ambiguities in the Constitution. For example, the language of the 12th Amendment doesn't say what to do if there's a dispute. It states, "The President of the Senate shall, in the presence of the Senate and House of Representatives, open all the certificates and the votes shall then be counted." Foley notes the passive voice in the line, "The votes shall be counted." But who is counting the ballots? In such cases, Congress can fill the gaps of the ambiguity, such as the case with Nixon in 1960. Under the 12th Amendment, if a president hasn't been picked or failed to qualify, then the vice president-elect will act as president until the president is qualified, or Congress might decide neither president-elect or VP-elect shall have qualified. Then Congress decides who is president. In another scenario, the House has an election, 50 states, 50 votes. But if no majority is reached there, then the Senate hopefully has successfully picked a VP who becomes acting president until the House of Representatives manages to elect a president by the required majority vote. But if the Senate also fails, then the Speaker becomes acting president, Nancy Pelosi. But if it's disputed whether a president has been elected or not, we turn to what Foley calls the astonishingly messy language of the Electoral Count Act of 1887, with both sides arguing for their case. So from January 6th to the 20th, Pence would preside in his role as president of the Senate, counting electoral votes starting alphabetically with Alabama, until getting to a contested state, maybe Pennsylvania. And then Pence has two submissions. He gives both to the Senate and House for separate consideration. But if they disagree, then he moves on to the next state, Rhode Island. Foley predicts in this scenario, Attorney General William Barr would announce that he believes the position of Trump and Pence is legally and constitutionally sound, and that they should be recognized as re-elected for second terms. In this scenario, Foley says Pelosi dismisses Barr's announcement as nothing more than Trump's lawyers saying whatever Trump once said. She argues that it is patiently evident that Biden won. Pelosi says that if the military, the FBI, and other federal security forces refuse to obey her orders as acting president starting at noon on January 20th, then the American people must take to the streets in a massive nationwide demonstration of people power to show that their democracy will not be stolen from them. Given this situation, what is the military to do starting at noon on January 20th? Who should the military recognize as commander-in-chief? Who would the military give the nuclear launch codes to, Trump or Pelosi? One crucial difference would be the state's governor, depending on whether the contested state's governor was Democrat or Republican. Why might this matter? Foley writes, suppose the governor signs a new state law providing for direct appointment of the state's electors by legislature. And then the governor certifies the appointment of these electors as authoritatively those of the state. Suppose, too, the governor refuses to certify the appointment of electors as shown by the final count of the popular vote after the blue shift during the canvass. Because of the ambiguities in the Constitution, the nation could be left in uncertainty. In this case, the Supreme Court would have to step in, regardless of how reluctantly it may want to, after the whole Bush versus Gore ruling in 2000. Foley says it is important to resolve any disputes ahead of January 20th, so the military isn't left wondering who the commander-in-chief is. So what happens before January 20th? Article 2 of the Constitution requires that the presidential electors of every state meet on the same day to cast their votes for president. Congress has specified that date as Monday, December 14th, as Congress is entitled to do. Up until that time, state law may determine the method of appointing a state's electors. As Article 2 also provides, both state and federal courts can also get involved. What if, come January 20th, Trump refuses to concede and says he's still president, and Nancy Pelosi refuses as well and says she's acting president? What happens then? If both refuse to give ground, the courts would get involved. One way is the changing of the nature of the lawsuits. Instead of a claim brought by Democratic electors seeking an injunction against the president or the Senate or Congress, imagine a lawsuit brought by an individual whose personal rights would be effective if Nancy Pelosi is acting president, instead of Trump being president. This way, Foley says, the court would issue a decree not necessarily about the president, but at least to tell the military who to listen to starting on January 20th. But ambiguities do exist. This kind of judicial decree is still different than telling Pence and Congress what to do under the Electoral Count Act or the 12th Amendment. Say the hypothetical lawsuit by Democrats from the above example was successful, Biden would become president-elect. This judicial decree would result in Biden taking the oath of office as president by virtue of the 12th Amendment. But in another scenario, say the courts accept the proposition that Nancy Pelosi becomes acting president as long as the electoral count remains unfinished. Then the consequences as Pelosi becomes acting president, rather than Biden becoming president, is significant. Foley concludes by saying it's ultimately up to Congress. Even if President Trump maintains he is still president, if Congress conclusively concludes that Biden is the winner, then the military will follow suit. But if he says the two houses of Congress cannot agree as to which candidate won the presidential election, then the Supreme Court would have to step in and settle the matter. But there is another scenario. If there was what Foley calls an extraordinary calamity, like a foreign cyber attack, for there to be conditions enabling partisans to dispute the result. What can be seen then is in history and in the Constitution, there exists a lot of ambiguity. Questions remain. Can the Electoral College decisively make a decision on December 14th, or would it be like the election of 1876, where a winner wasn't declared till 2 days before inauguration? There's lots of uncertainties, but on the front of the military, there's been a lot of changes there as well. Trump has done many things with the military. It's not clear what effects these could have. But some changes to note. Trump signed an executive order in 2018 on election integrity. He fired Defense Secretary Mark Esper this year. He could be laying some groundwork. Trump's new Defense Secretary, Chris Miller, is known to be tough on counterterrorism. And Trump is planning on pulling troops back to the U.S. from Afghanistan and Iraq. So as we near December 14th, things to keep in mind. The Electoral College might not be able to make a decision. And if it does, it might not be the final one. Based on historical examples and even the Constitution itself, we may not see a conclusion to the election challenges. In this case, the future remains uncertain. But let me know what you think below. Thanks for watching Deep Dive. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm Tiffany Meier, and see you soon.